TIK History is a military history YouTuber well known for citing sources explicitly in his videos, frequently including full quotations on screen and pointing to a lengthy list of references linked to in his video description. But just because someone cites many sources, that doesn't mean their claims are necessarily reliable. If their sources are poor, their claims may not be supported at all. In this video, we'll see how on one particular occasion TIK fails to validate his video's sources and is therefore led astray by false history, which he then passes on to you. Nearly 8 minutes into his video, The Real Religion Behind National Socialism, TIK says he's going to, quote, ask you guys to take a bit of a leap of faith, end quote, adding, quote, you need to accept the premise that there is a huge ancient religion that does exist, but that you've probably never heard of it, end quote, which honestly sounds like something a hipster of the early 2000s would say. Citing the Freemasons, Illuminati, and Theosophists, he says, quote, all these cults have something in common. They are denominations of this ancient and prehistoric religion, end quote. That's quite a leap of faith he's asking for, and you might wonder why faith is necessary. So, does he have any evidence for this claim? Or is he just making some kind of religious appeal? Let's find out. This is the first in a series of videos examining TIK's claims. TIK hasn't read Joachim of Fiore's writings. TIK starts by introducing us to the 12th century Italian abbot Joachim of Fiore, saying he, quote, read the Bible and decided to reinterpret it. He believed that the Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit symbolized the 3 stages of history, end quote. This is kind of true. Joachim believed in 3 stages of history, but he did not believe they were the only stages of history. His historical schema was quite complicated, using both divisions of 3 and 7. TIK doesn't understand any of this because he doesn't really know what Joachim was basing this on in the first place. This will become very important later. TIK tells us, quote, the first period was the Father, which was the time before Jesus came along. The second period was the Son, which is when Jesus appeared. And then the third age was the Holy Spirit. This, he said, would begin in 1260, because why not? End quote. This is one of the reasons why we know TIK hasn't read Joachim and doesn't really understand how Joachim formed his chronology. I happen to have read Joachim's actual works and studied both his writings and numerous commentaries on them, both historical and modern, over a couple of years, so I can say with all fairness that I am considerably better informed on Joachim than TIK. I also know exactly how TIK has been led astray in his understanding of Joachim. It's a result of him being uncritical with his sources. But we'll get to that later. Joachim wasn't simply interpreting the Bible, he was interpreting a very specific part of the Bible, the book of Revelation, traditionally the last book of the New Testament. In that book, the number 1260 appears, along with the period 42 months, which is another way of saying 1260 days, and the period time, times, and half a time, which is 3.5 years. Another way of saying 1260 days. Early Christian commentators had long since identified these as not literal days, but symbolic time periods. Consequently, when Joachim interpreted them as years, he was in fact simply following previously established principles of biblical interpretation, which earlier Christians had already used. It's true that he seems to have been the first to interpret the 1260 days of Revelation chapter 11 verse 3 and chapter 12 verse 6 as specifically 1260 years, but the principle of interpreting prophetic days for years had been used by the Christian scholar Tychonius as early as the 4th century, when he interpreted the 3.5 days of Revelation chapter 11 verse 11 as 3.5 years. So this still wasn't a radical interpretive methodology. It's essential to understand this because so much of Joachim's interpretation of Revelation is based on the work of earlier Christian and even Jewish commentators of the Bible. He wasn't simply making it up as he went along, and he was absolutely not a Gnostic. He was drawing on Jewish and Christian tradition, not Gnostic. His general interpretation of Revelation was entirely within standard Christian historicist conventions of interpretation, which had been established by earlier Christian commentators from the 2nd century onwards, such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus of Lyon, Hippolytus of Rome, and Victorinus of Patau. Joachim's interpretation of Revelation was thoroughly Christian. In fact, Nerses of Lambron, the Archbishop of Tarsus and one of Joachim's contemporaries, interpreted the 1260 days of Revelation 12 verse 6 as 1260 years, just as Joachim did, and independently from Joachim, though he believed they would end in the return of Jesus Christ. So Joachim's selection of this period wasn't simply a matter of why not, it was a product of his expository technique, which itself is essential to understand in order to understand his actual interpretation of Revelation and the true meaning of his tripartite chronology, which TIK has completely misinterpreted. Let's look at that now. TIK writes that Joachim believed that in the future he himself would, quote, lead a priestly brotherhood who would have the Holy Spirit of God descend into them from the heavens. With this divine revelation, they would transform into new men and usher in the new age. Of course, in this new age, these new men would embrace the idea of a community of spirituality, where they would all live together without the need for institutional authority, aka the state, end quote. Note how TIK sneaks in the phrase new men, as well as the term institutional authority, which he further explicates as the state. That's TIK reading his own ideas back into Joachim's words. Joachim didn't write anything like that, but TIK is trying to argue that Joachim held Gnostic beliefs which the Nazis would also hold later, so he deliberately gives the impression that Joachim used words which sound like words the Nazis would use to make his listeners believe that Joachim and the Nazis both held these same supposedly Gnostic beliefs. We're going to see him do that quite a lot in his video, tweaking a word here, adding a word there, massaging the sources so they sound the way he wants. Even granting this is unintentional, and TIK is simply trying to explain what he thinks the sources mean, it's still a misleading way of representing the sources. So to be completely fair to TIK, I don't believe he's being deliberately deceptive here. It's just that he's reading a source with a preconceived conclusion, and I already know why this is happening. TIK is being influenced partly by an academic work on Gnosticism and Hermeticism, which he discovered through YouTuber James Lindsay, who misrepresented what the book said about Gnosticism, so TIK has the wrong idea about Gnosticism. TIK is also being influenced by a book published in 1952 by the German-American philosopher Eric Voegelin, who completely misunderstood both Gnosticism and Joachim. TIK has been led astray by his sources, which he didn't fact-check. We'll examine both of those sources later and do the due diligence which TIK neglected. TIK misrepresents Joachim's prophecy. So let's return to Joachim. He didn't write anything about a class of new men who would embrace a community of spirituality and all live together without institutional authority, whether in the form of the state or otherwise. Firstly, he wrote about God's Holy Spirit being given specifically to members of the same Catholic holy order to which he belonged. These are the only new men of whom he wrote, and they weren't merely men. They're described explicitly as both men and women. Of course, he never actually calls them new men. He calls them the new people of God, meaning a new order of monks and nuns. They're supposed to be mostly involved in manual labor, prayer, tending to the sick and poor, and reading and studying the Bible to gain more knowledge, though Joachim says some of them won't be smart enough to know as much as others. Secondly, he explicitly wrote about preserving institutional authority, specifically the institutional authority of the church. He didn't write of a general community of spirituality. He wrote about a complex organization of monks and nuns in a strictly hierarchical church order, separated into various monasteries and nunneries, some of which would have more authority over others, and within which there would be leaders with varying levels of power. A few excerpts from his writings will illustrate this point. Quote, "This house will be the mother of all. The spiritual fathers who will be over all will be in it. All will obey his direction and authority." End quote. And again, quote, "There will be learned men and also those to be instructed and taught by God. They desire and have more power than the others." End quote. And again, quote, "They will obey their prior," that's their religious leader, "according to the order and will of the spiritual father, who will be over all." End quote. Yes, this is a strict religious hierarchy. No communism or anarchism here. The Christians to whom he was writing would have found this instantly recognizable as a particularly stringent order of monks and nuns. Joachim writes pages of detail about how there will be rules governing diet, times of prayer, times for and divisions of labour, when people are allowed to speak and when they must stay silent, who is allowed to visit, where they are allowed to go, and who isn't allowed to sleep with their spouse. Breaking these rules would be punishable by expulsion. On top of all this, monks and nuns would need to pay a tithe, that is, a tenth of their produce, which will be given to the leader of their monastery or nunnery. Not only is this a form of taxation, it's the opposite of common property under communism, where everything belongs to everyone else. Now, there is a statement in this section of Joachim's work which says, quote, "They will have food and clothing in common," end quote, which would probably sound like communism to TIK. But this isn't really communism. This is just the usual communal living arrangement which was common to monasteries and nunneries of the time. It doesn't even mean they would own the same food and clothing or share the same clothes. It just means they would all eat the same kind of food and wear the same kind of clothing. The closest Joachim comes to anything like true communalism, but again, not even communism, is a passage in which he says that the tithes taken from, quote, "honest and approved women," end quote, will be used, quote, "for the support of the poor and strangers, and also for the boys who are studying doctrine," end quote. He further says that, at the discretion of the spiritual father, quote, "the surplus will be taken from those who have more and given to those who have less, so that there may be no one in need among them, but all things held in common," end quote. But this only applies to these honest and approved women workers, not to all the men and women in the community, and their tithes are only used to support the poor, strangers, and the boys who are studying doctrine. So there is no community-wide common ownership, and the only people who are given any kind of welfare are poor and strangers who are not members of the community, and the boys who are studying doctrine instead of working. Again, this is neither communism nor socialism. Note also that the very fact that there are poor people and strangers during this Third Age reminds us that Joachim's Third Age does not involve a worldwide utopia, only a local revival of spirituality among these religious men and women who would separate themselves from the corrupt church and devote themselves to piety and the service of God, while everyone else continued to live as they always had. Joachim goes on to remind us of just how hierarchical and anti-communist this society would be, writing that members are to, quote, "obey their master according to the direction and order of the spiritual father, to whom all these orders will be obedient, like a new Ark of Noah, finished down to the cubit," end quote. Joachim also has some strong words to say about labour, writing, quote, "No idle person will be found among these Christians, someone who will not earn his bread, that he may have that from which to help those in need," end quote. So, if you don't work, you don't eat. No freeloaders will be permitted in this community, and no handouts will be given to community members. This is neither communism nor TIK's typical understanding of socialism. There's no social security for the lazy here. Joachim goes on to lay down even more rules about labour, writing, quote, "let each one work at his own craft, and the individual trades and workers shall have their own foreman. Anyone who has not worked up to capacity should be called to account by the master and censured by all," end quote. So, a very typical hierarchical arrangement of labour, with workers at the bottom doing the actual work, and foremen at the top telling them what to do. And if you don't meet your work quota, you'll be called to the boss and reprimanded, just like in a typical capitalist company. Joachim has pages more of this stuff, but this is already beyond sufficient to correct TIK's false characterization of Joachim's future community. TIK also tells us Joachim believed, quote, Christ would come back to earth and lead this community for 1,000 years, just like it says in the Bible. Rather than dying and going to heaven, it would be a heaven on earth, a third Rome, if you will, end quote. No, Joachim didn't say this would be a heaven on earth instead of people dying and going to heaven. Because TIK hasn't actually read Joachim, he doesn't understand that the men and women living during this time period, which, by the way, wouldn't be exactly 1,000 years, because Joachim believed this was a symbolic number, people would be dying and going to heaven, because this would still very much be the earth with actual mortals on it, not a heaven on earth. None of this is remotely Gnostic or Hermetic. Notice also how TIK identifies Joachim's third age as, quote, a third Rome, if you will, end quote. No, I won't. That's just another example of him sneaking in words to associate Joachim's writings with ideas which Joachim never had. TIK wants this third Rome idea because then he can connect it with the Third Reich of the Nazis, creating a false impression of a continuity of a specific apocalyptic vision from Gnosticism through Joachim to the Nazis. Joachim does not identify this third age as a third Rome or anything like it, and it would have been incomprehensible for him to do so, since in his interpretation the wicked city of Babylon in the book of Revelation represents the city of Rome as the seat of evil and the source of the Antichrist. TIK doesn't understand the entire context of Joachim's interpretation of Revelation, which was his view that the Catholic Church had become corrupt and that the Antichrist would be a Christian leader from Rome, within the church itself. TIK also doesn't understand Joachim wrote of an era after this third age when Christ would return and the last judgment would take place, after which anyone still alive would go to heaven or hell. TIK further claims, quote, Joachim of Fiore got his ideas from previous scholars which he translated, and their ideas were influential in the underground secret societies of the time until they came to surface in the 12th and 13th centuries, end quote. Well, as I've already said, it's true that Joachim's ideas mainly came from previous scholars, but as I've already observed, they were Christian interpreters of Revelation whose works were not influential in the underground secret societies of the time. Notice how TIK never even names any of these supposed underground secret societies which came to surface in the 12th and 13th centuries. That's because he doesn't know what they were, and the reason for that is that they didn't exist. And if you're already thinking ahead, then no, the Albigenses, Cathars, Bogomils, and related Christian heretical groups don't count. They were neither secret nor underground, and they only emerged just before Joachim himself was born. Joachim certainly didn't get his ideas from the Gnostics. TIK then says, quote, but you should also note the 4 elements of Joachim of Fiore's ideas which are still floating around to this day. The first being that there were 3 stages of history, like what Hegel, Hitler and Marx laid out: primitive communism, class society, and then final communism, end quote. He takes this virtually word for word from political philosopher Eric Voegelin's 1952 book, The New Science of Politics, An Introduction. Voegelin claimed Joachim's interpretation had 4 symbols, the first of which was the idea of history divided into 3 eras. Voegelin claimed that this tripartite view of history later morphed into the Enlightenment view of ancient, medieval, and modern history, as well as, quote, Hegel's dialectic of the 3 stages of freedom and self-reflective spiritual fulfillment, the Marxian dialectic of the 3 stages of primitive communism, class society, and final communism, and finally the National Socialist symbol of the Third Realm, end quote. Voegelin never provides any evidence for this claim, and the idea that all 3 of these very different systems of thought all borrowed from Joachim's division of history, despite the fact that none of them have anything in common except that they all count 3 of something, is totally absurd. Of course, Joachim's 3 stages of history aren't remotely describing a historical sequence of primitive communism, class society, and then final communism. Joachim didn't even think in terms of these socio-economic categories. His text is a theological interpretation of a spiritual book, and the stages of history he describes have a strict theological and spiritual basis. His whole idea of dividing history into three is based on the three persons of the Trinity, not three socio-economic systems. He describes the first stage, the era of the Father, as when humanity was under law, specifically the law of Moses, since he sees God the Father as a lawgiver and authority. He describes the second stage, the era of the Son, as when humanity was freed from the law of Moses and came under grace, since he sees God the Son, that is, Jesus Christ, as the bringer of grace and abolisher of the law of Moses. He describes the third stage, the era of the Holy Spirit, as the era of spiritual enlightenment from God, since he sees God the Holy Spirit as the means by which God inspires faithful members of the clergy to understand his word. None of this is anything like the Enlightenment division of history, or Hegel's dialectic, or Marx's theory of socio-economic development, or the Nazis' Third Reich. Again, the only thing in common here is literally the number 3. TIK depends on an unreliable source. It's important to understand why Vogelin was so bad at understanding Joachim. The problem was, at the time Vogelin was writing, he had very little access to Joachim's original works, so he was relying on the writings of secondary sources, scholars commenting on the various parts of Joachim's commentaries which were available at the time. Gnostic scholar Fryderyk Kwiatkowski comments, quote, "Most of the editorial endeavours toward publishing Joachim's main works have been initiated only after Vogelin died in 1985." End quote. So Vogelin was extremely underinformed about what Joachim really believed. Later, TIK provides this quotation, quote, "To be sure, Hitler's millennial prophecy authentically derives from Joachitic speculation, mediated in Germany through the Anabaptist wing of the Reformation and through the Johannine Christianity of Fichte, Hegel and Schelling." End quote. As he tells us, this comes straight from Vogelin. TIK accepts this statement of Vogelin's completely uncritically, since he is fixated on the idea of Nazism being a form of Gnostic religion, and since he is convinced that Joachim held these Gnostic beliefs, and since he is also convinced that Joachim's 3 ages inspired Hitler's idea of a Third Reich. But if he had actually read just a little further down the same page in Vogelin's book, he would have found out that although Vogelin believed Hitler's idea of a 1,000-year Reich was descended from Joachim's prophecy concerning the 1,000 years of Revelation chapter 20, Vogelin did not believe that Hitler borrowed his Third Reich idea from Joachim's 3 eras of history. On the contrary, Vogelin wrote, quote, "The National Socialist propagandists picked it up from Müller-Vondenbrock's tract of that name, and Müller, who had no National Socialist intentions, had found it as a convenient symbol in the course of his work on the German edition of Dostoevsky." End quote. The German term Dritter Reich used by Müller means Third Reich. Now you can see why TIK wanted to associate Joachim's Third Age with the idea of a Third Rome, so he can draw a line from supposedly ancient Gnosticism to Joachim's apocalyptic millennial Third Age, and then from Joachim's supposedly Gnostic apocalyptic millennial Third Age to the Nazis' Third Reich and 1,000-year Reich. But Vogelin does not do this. Vogelin does say that the idea of a 1,000-year kingdom was inherited by the Nazis from Joachim through later German Christian groups, but not the idea of a Third Age, Third Reich, or Third Rome. Instead, Vogelin says the idea of a Third Age or Third Reich was borrowed by the Nazis from the German historian and nationalist Müller, whose 1923 book Das Dritte Reich literally means the Third Reich, and that Müller himself had borrowed it from the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. Vogelin also says the idea of the Third Rome was inherited by the Nazis from the Russians, writing, quote, "The Russian idea of the Third Rome is characterized by the same blend of an eschatology of the spiritual realm with its realization by a political society as the National Socialist idea of the Dritte Reich." End quote. He cites a letter from Russian monk Philotheus of Pskov stating that after the first Rome fell, Constantinople became the second Rome, and that after Constantinople fell, Moscow became the Third Rome. So Vogelin attributes the Nazi idea of a Third Rome or Third Reich to the Russians, not Joachim, and certainly not the Gnostics. Now, we've already seen that Joachim didn't believe the 1000 years in Revelation was actually a literal number anyway, which is something Vogelin most likely didn't realize himself. So it's not even possible for the idea of a 1000-year earthly kingdom by a state to have descended from Joachim to Hitler. Joachim didn't even believe in this. Remember also that previously TIK assured us that Joachim's vision was of a 1000-year stateless communism, the very opposite of Hitler's view. TIK is wrong about Joachim's influence. TIK then tells us very directly, quote, "My point here is to introduce the idea that National Socialism, Marxism, and many of these other religions are nothing new. They are merely a spin on an old religion that spans back to the dawn of human history. There is a continuation of ideas from ancient Egypt and Assyria all the way up to Marx and Hitler." End quote. This is exactly what I've already said he was doing, and it's useful to have him spell it out like this. Of course, TIK's entire case rests completely on the historical existence of an old religion that spans back to the dawn of human history, so we'll need to fact-check him on that. You might have already guessed that he never actually provides any primary source evidence for this. TIK provides more information on this idea, saying, quote, "But this religion can be traced back to ancient Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, and Persia, and Plato referred to it as being old when he was writing, which means that it has its origin in prehistoric times. Now, the exact time and place it was created is unknown. We just know that it stretches back beyond the written word, and is still around today. So this could actually be one of the oldest religions in the world. And you might ask, well, how come I haven't heard of it? And part of the reason why is because it doesn't have a name. For ease, I'm going to refer to it as Gnosticism, but technically that's only one branch of it. Another branch of it is called Hermeticism, for example." End quote. This isn't true. There is no such religion of which TIK speaks, which is why not only is he unable to name it, he can't even cite any evidence for its supposed existence in the deep past. Hand-waving at Plato and citing Vogelin doesn't achieve this, and in the next video in this series we'll see that Vogelin couldn't find any evidence for his claims either. You can tell TIK hasn't read any recent scholarship on Joachim because the whole idea of Joachim inspiring several of the major philosophical and economic intellectuals of the 19th and 20th centuries has been addressed and debunked thoroughly by scholars of Joachim. In fact, I'll quote here from an academic work on Joachim debunking this myth as far back as 1987. Editors Marjorie Reeves and Warwick Gould write, quote, "The political examples of thinking in threes which have been claimed for Joachimism illustrate strikingly the ease with which a pattern of threes can be derived spontaneously from independent historical sequences." End quote. Yes, that's right. They're pointing out that once you decide on a pattern as vague as 3 ideas about something, you can find it pretty much anywhere you like. Remember, this was written all the way back in 1987, yet TIK is completely unaware of this. Why? Because he hasn't done any proper research on this subject and is simply recycling Vogelin's claims without even fact-checking them, let alone checking to see what actual qualified scholars of Joachim's history and literature have to say on the subject. After pointing out there is no evidence for Vogelin's proposed connection between Joachim and the concept of the Third Reich, Reeves and Gould say, quote, "Yet Vogelin claims that Hitler's millennial prophecy authentically derives from Joachitic speculation." End quote. Note how they point out that Vogelin makes a claim he never substantiates, which TIK seems completely unaware of. Now, TIK might still disagree with these scholars, but in order to do so on a rational basis, he needs to read their arguments first and address them with actual evidence. But he doesn't even provide any evidence for his own claims regarding Joachim, let alone Vogelin's. He just quotes Vogelin, accepts what he says, and thinks he has done all the necessary work to establish his case. This isn't historical research, it's just parroting a random scholar without even being aware of how ignorant they were of the subject on which they were writing, and without doing any personal analysis of the relevant primary or secondary literature. Because Reeves and Gould have actually done proper historical research, they can describe the emergence of the concept of the Third Reich properly, writing, quote, "The term Third Reich was first applied to a future German state by Müller-Vandenbroek in his book Das Dritte Reich, published in 1922. There is not a trace of Joachimist thinking in the book itself, and here again the pattern of threes has an obvious political origin. The Habsburg Empire was the first, the Bismarckian the second, and now the third must be constructed." End quote. See the difference between Vogelin's unsubstantiated claims and the fact-based research of Reeves and Gould? Additionally, Reeves and Gould demonstrate their intellectual honesty when they note that Oswald Spengler, cited by Vogelin and TIK, connected the concept of the Third Reich with Joachim in 1923, claiming, quote, "The Third Reich is the German ideal, an eternal tomorrow, to which all great men from Joachim of Fiore to Nietzsche and Ibsen tied their lives." End quote. Consequently, Reeves and Gould very generously say, quote, "It can therefore be argued that, in a vague general sense, Joachim's expectation of a third, more glorious age to come may have encouraged such thinking." End quote. But of course, even this generous concession is far from agreeing with the claim that the concept of the Third Reich originated from Joachim's three-stage historical scheme, only accepting that it's possible to argue that in some vague way his view of a third age to come, quote, "may have encouraged such thinking," end quote. Then they go further, doing the historical work which neither Vogelin or TIK attempted, correctly observing, quote, "Then one must inquire closely what people in later ages actually knew about Joachim and whether his genuine system of thought was readily accessible to them." End quote. That's the issue here. If Vogelin and TIK want to assert a historical continuation of Joachim's thought from the 12th century right through to the 20th century, and further assert specific effects and influences of Joachim's thought on particular individuals and their ideologies, they absolutely must do the historical research necessary to uncover the evidence supporting such a continuation. But neither of them do. As we will see in the next video in this series, Vogelin deliberately avoided doing this, skipping hurriedly over the hard historical work required of him with a dismissive phrase and some hand-waving. TIK doesn't even bother to fact-check Vogelin, let alone do the research Vogelin never did. After surveying historical references to Joachim's work from his own era to the 19th century, the kind of work which Vogelin and TIK should have done, Reeves and Gould write, quote, "Thus, most of the passing references to Joachim do not prove the influence of his ideas. The curious fact emerges that, when Joachim is cited, the reference is most often not to his three status, while on the other hand, ideas of three stages or of a coming new era are most often adumbrated without any allusion to Joachimism. By the early 19th century, the idea of a coming third age is widespread, but there are no direct references to Joachim." End quote. I'll remind you this was written all the way back in 1987. TIK's video is repeating ancient, long-debunked myth. Again, I am sure TIK may want to dispute Reeves and Gould's conclusions, but if he does, he needs to do the actual historical research necessary to do so rationally. He needs to do the hard work of identifying, reading, and analysing the relevant primary sources, or at least addressing the current Joachim scholarship in the relevant secondary sources. Reeves and Gould then explain that on the basis of the evidence they have reviewed, quote, "The threefold scheme of history or an expectation of a coming new age are not in themselves proofs of Joachimist influence. More rigorous criteria must be applied, either direct citation of Joachim's work or the appearance of some distinctively Joachimist doctrine, whether accurately or inaccurately understood." End quote. Here they propose sensible criteria for establishing Joachim's influence, criteria which should be met by anyone making such a claim. A few pages later, they present the question, quote, "In what forms did a direct knowledge of Joachim's doctrine reach 19th century thinkers? Who made conscious use of it? And how did they handle the sources from which they derived their knowledge?" End quote. They then address this with an analysis of historical sources from Joachim's era to the 19th century, noting that many writers who came after Joachim relied not on Joachim's own work itself, but on the numerous pseudepigraphal texts which were written by other people in Joachim's name, but which contained different ideas. They further write, quote, "The conclusion to be drawn, it would seem, is that in learned circles, Joachim's commentary on the Apocalypse was being used for specific historical interpretations, but that Joachim's full Trinitarian theology of history and doctrine of the third status was seldom imbibed." End quote. Reeves and Gould continue their analysis to the end of the chapter, demonstrating there is no historical evidence for the continuity of Joachim's influence asserted by Vogelin. Remember, this is scholarship from all the way back in 1987, of which TIK is clearly completely unaware. I could quote much more from Reeves and Gould, as well as from more modern scholars who agree with this position, but I'll save that for another video if I really need it. Finally, I want to note that TIK tells us that while Gnosticism is one of the branches of this mysterious religion, Hermeticism is one of the others. In later videos in this series, we'll look at Hermeticism as well, but the next video will be on Eric Vogelin and Gnosticism. TIK is relying heavily on Vogelin's understanding of Gnosticism, but as we'll see, Vogelin was even more ignorant of Gnosticism than he was of Joachim, and TIK isn't even aware of this. TIK is not only wildly wrong on this subject, he's so uninformed he doesn't even know how wrong he is.